Carl Jung spent 60 years mapping the most important journey a human being can take. He called it individuation, and he said most people never even begin it. Nobody told you that growing up and becoming yourself are two entirely different things. The world handed you both as though they were the same process, as though the accumulation of years and experience and the gradual assumption of adult responsibilities was the same thing as the emergence of a genuine self from underneath everything that had been placed on top of it. They are not the same thing. They have almost nothing in common. Growing up is something that happens to you. Individuation is something you have to choose, and the choice is not made once, dramatically, at a moment of clear intention. It is made in 1,000 ordinary moments across years, in the specific gap between the automatic response and the considered one, between what the performed self would do and what the actual self is oriented toward. Carl Jung named this process in 1916 and spent the remaining 45 years of his career refining the map he had drawn of it, not because he found it simple, because he found it the most important thing he could spend a life on. The map he left behind is not a self-help framework. It is not a personality system. It is a precise psychological account of the process by which a human being moves from the fragmented, performed, socially constructed version of themselves that most people inhabit entirely to the integrated whole, genuinely expressed version that was available from the beginning, but that the conditions of ordinary development prevent most people from ever fully reaching. This video is that map, not the simplified version, the actual one, and what it will give you, if you stay with it completely, is not motivation or inspiration or the temporary elevation of a well-produced piece of content. It will give you the orientation that most people spend their entire adult lives searching for without knowing the name of what they are looking for. You are going to understand what is happening to you, not in general terms, in the specific, precise, navigable terms of someone who has been given the map of the territory they are already moving through. The starting point of the individuation process is not where most people expect it to be. It does not begin with a dramatic crisis or a spiritual awakening or a decision to change. It begins with a question so ordinary that most people dismiss it before it can fully form. The question is this mine? Not asked about a possession or a circumstance, asked about the entire configuration of the self that is currently being inhabited. The beliefs, the emotional patterns, the relational dynamics, the values that organize the daily choices, the definition of success that the forward momentum is pointed toward. Is this mine? Did I arrive at this through genuine examination, deepest orientation toward existence, from the environments that shaped me, what I was being given, safety in exchange for certain, from the cultural and social programming that operates so consistently, indistinguishable from individual preference, not uninitiated in the spiritual sense? The person who has arrived at full chronological adulthood carrying an forces external to the actual self, specific and demanding work of distinguishing. This condition is not a personal failure. The developmental conditions of human childhood produce it almost inevitably. Emotional resources to evaluate, they adapt. They become what their environments require them to, is itself an extraordinary survival achievement. When the survival achievement becomes the entire self, becomes the identity that constrains the adult, finally surfaces and the honest answer is not entirely clear, and where most accounts of individuation become vague in a way that Jung identified the first structure of the psyche. He called it the persona, the face that communicates the role. The persona is not a lie. It is the necessary social face. It is constructed for every person develops one. It generates the consistent, recognizable. It is not the enemy of individuation. It begins to be mistaken for the self, rather. The inflation of the persona happens so gradually that most people never notice it occurring. Each approval received for the personas, self beneath it, less visible, of my own experience and my own nature and my own, or did I receive it before I had the capacity to evaluate from the relationships that provided kinds of conformity, and so pervasively that it becomes. Jung called this the condition of the uninitiated adult, but in the psychological sense, identity that was substantially assembled by, without having yet undertaken the what is genuinely theirs from what was installed. It is nearly universal. Children do not have the cognitive or what is being installed in them. They absorb, become with a completeness that the problem appears later, when the adaptation that preserved the child, when the question, is this mine? Here is where the map gets specific, makes the practical entry into it feel impossible. That must be understood before anything else. The word comes from the Latin term for the mask worn by actors in ancient theater. Jung used it precisely. It is not a performance in the pejorative sense, the version of the self that functional engagement with the external world. It allows social navigation, predictable self that other people can form stable relationships with. But it becomes the obstacle to individuation at the specific moment, then recognized as one of the self's social instruments. Jung's precise term for when the mask becomes the face. Each social success reinforces the performed version. Qualities makes the qualities of the actual. Less practiced, less available, the persona gets sophisticated. It gets rewarded. It generates belonging and status and the functional satisfactions of a life that works, and the self underneath it becomes increasingly unfamiliar. Not just to other people, but to the person wearing the persona. By the time most people begin the individuation process, they are not only unfamiliar to others in their actual nature, they are unfamiliar to themselves. And the work of individuation begins precisely here, not with dramatic self-disclosure or radical authenticity or any of the surface-level prescriptions that circulate in popular psychology, with the much more demanding and much more specific work of becoming genuinely curious about what is actually there underneath the persona. Not what you want to find, not what you hope is there. What is actually there, in the honest and often uncomfortable inventory of what has been performed versus what has been real. Wait. Because what comes next in the map is the part that most accounts of individuation get wrong. And getting it wrong is what makes the process feel like failure when it is actually the most important phase. The second structure Jung mapped is the shadow. And I need to tell you directly what it is and what it is not. Because the popular understanding of the shadow has been simplified to the point of uselessness. The shadow is not your dark side. It is not the worst of you. It is not the violent impulses or the selfish desires or the shameful secrets that need to be confessed and processed and released. It is simply, precisely, the parts of yourself that were not given permission to exist in the light, the qualities that the persona's successful maintenance required to be suppressed, not because they were dangerous or harmful in themselves, because they were incompatible with the version of you that generated the responses you needed from the environments that mattered. The child who was raised in an environment where anger was dangerous or unwelcome developed a persona that did not include anger. The anger went into the shadow, not eliminated, present in the shadow, pressing upward in the specific ways that suppressed material always presses, through the disproportionate reactions, through the projection of the suppressed quality onto other people, through the recurring friction in relationships that seems to have no adequate explanation. The child who was raised in an environment where vulnerability was coded as weakness developed a persona of competence and self-sufficiency. The vulnerability went into the shadow, not eliminated, running the life from the specific underground location that suppressed material occupies as a secret need for reassurance that the persona prevents from being expressed, as a specific sensitivity to any hint of inadequacy that the competent performed. Self cannot afford to acknowledge every quality that was not welcome in the light of the performed. Identity is present in the shadow, including, and this is the part most people do not anticipate, qualities that are not negative in any conventional sense. The creativity that was suppressed because it was impractical, the sensitivity that was suppressed because it was excessive, the specific intelligence that was suppressed because it was uncomfortable for the environments that needed something more manageable, the ambition that was suppressed because it exceeded what the family's emotional framework could accommodate without disruption. These are in the shadow too. Jung called this the golden shadow, the unlived potential that the persona's successful maintenance required to go underground. And the golden shadow is often the most important discovery of the individuation process, because the person who integrates it does not just become more whole. They discover capacities for expression and contribution that were present from the beginning and that the performed identity spent years concealing without knowing that the concealment was costing them the most essential thing about themselves. But here is the turn that most people are not prepared for, and this is where the individuation map saves people significant unnecessary suffering if they encounter it at the right moment. Integrating the shadow does not mean becoming the suppressed material. It does not mean the person who suppressed anger becomes an angry person. It does not mean the person who suppressed vulnerability collapses into neediness. It does not mean the person who suppressed ambition becomes reckless or selfish or unrecognizable unrecognizable to the people who loved the performed version of them. Integration means something more precise and more demanding than expression. It means bringing the suppressed material into conscious relationship with the persona, not allowing one to replace the other, but developing the interior capacity to hold both simultaneously. The anger that was suppressed does not need to be unleashed. It needs to be acknowledged. It needs to be recognized as information, as the signal it always was, pointing at the specific situations where something real in you was being required to disappear. The vulnerability that was suppressed does not need to be performed for therapeutic benefit. It needs to be allowed to exist privately first, then gradually in the relationships where it is safe enough and reciprocal enough to receive it. The creativity that was suppressed does not need to become a career pivot or a public identity. It needs to be given the specific 15 minutes a day that the persona's performance schedule never allocated for it. Jung was precise about what he meant by integration. He did not mean transformation of character. He meant the development of a conscious relationship with the full interior, the performed self and the suppressed self in dialogue with each other rather than in the specific war of mutual suppression that produces the fragmentation and the exhaustion and the low-level suffering of a person who is perpetually divided against themselves. The integrated shadow does not make you a different person. It makes you a whole one, and wholeness, genuine wholeness, not the performed version of it, changes how you exist in every context. You move through, not because you change what you do, but because you change the interior from which the doing comes. Actions taken from wholeness have a quality that actions taken from division never produce. A presence, a specificity, a genuine alignment between the inner reality and the outer expression that other people feel before they can name it and respond to in ways that the performed self, however sophisticated, was never able to generate. Now the map reaches its most complex territory, and this is the part that Jung considered the most important and the most consistently misunderstood. He identified two structures in the unconscious that he called the Anima and the Animus. These are not about gender in the conventional sense. They are about the interior counterpart, the psychological qualities that were assigned by the cultural and developmental environment to the other, and that were therefore suppressed in the self, regardless of how suited to those qualities the individual's actual nature might have been. In the male psyche, the Anima represents the suppressed interior feminine, not femininity as a social performance, but the specific psychological qualities that human development has historically associated with the feminine and therefore historically denied to males. The emotional intelligence, the relational attunement, the capacity for vulnerability, the connection to the interior life, the ability to be moved rather than simply to move. In the female psyche, the animus represents the suppressed interior masculine, the assertiveness, the directional confidence, the capacity to occupy space without apology, the structural thinking, the willingness to pursue rather than simply receive. Both figures, when suppressed, create a specific distortion in the relationship with the outer world. The male who has not integrated his anima projects her onto external women, seeking in relationships with others what he has not developed access to within himself. The female who has not integrated her animus projects him onto external men, organizing her sense of direction and worth around the assessment of others rather than around her own interior orientation. Jung observed these projections with clinical precision, and he was careful about what he claimed for their resolution. He did not say that integrating the anima or animus eliminated attraction or transformed the nature of relationships. He said it changed their quality fundamentally. The person who has integrated their interior counterpart no longer relates to others, primarily through projection. They meet others as they actually are, not as screens onto which the suppressed interior is being cast. And this specific change in the quality of encounter produces relationships that the projected version was structurally incapable of generating. Not more relationships, not more successful ones by external metrics. Relationships in which something real in one person can meet something real in another, which is the only kind of relationship that addresses what relationships are actually for. The map now arrives at its destination, and I want you to understand what this destination is and what it is not before I name it, because the naming tends to produce either inflation, the specific ego distortion of someone who mistakes understanding, the concept for having achieved what the concept points toward, or dismissal, the specific defense of someone for whom the concept is threatening, enough that minimizing it feels like the safer choice. Jung called the destination the self with a capital S, not the ego self, the center of conscious identity, the narrator of the personal story, the self as the totality of the psyche, the integration of everything that is conscious and everything that is unconscious, the persona and the shadow, the anima or animus, and the deepest layer of the collective unconscious that Jung believed connected every individual psyche to the entire history of human psychological experience. The self is not achievable in the sense of a destination that, once reached, is permanently inhabited. It is approachable. It is the direction that the individuation process moves toward, not the endpoint that it reaches. Jung was explicit about this. He did not believe full individuation was possible in a single human lifetime. He believed the movement toward it, the sustained, honest, demanding engagement with the interior, was the most important thing a human life could be organized around. Not because it guaranteed happiness, not because it produced moral superiority, because it produced the specific quality of existence that he considered the closest available approach to a genuinely lived life. Not a life managed from the surface, not a life performed for external audiences, a life lived from the interior out, from the actual self, rather than the constructed one, in the specific, ordinary daily moments that constitute the entire texture of a human existence. Here is what the map requires of you practically. Because a map without navigation instructions is just a description of territory, Jung identified 3 specific practices that constitute the actual work of individuation, not the conceptual engagement with it, but the lived practice of it in ordinary daily experience. The first is attention to the interior life with the specific quality of honest curiosity rather than judgment. Dreams, the spontaneous images that arise in the transitional states between waking and sleeping, the recurring emotional patterns that seem disproportionate to their triggers, the specific people and situations that produce strong reactions without clear rational, because these are not random. They are the language of the unconscious communicating with the conscious mind. Most people ignore this language entirely. Most people who become aware of it treat it as material for analysis rather than for dialogue. Jung's practice was dialogue. He spent hours in his diary conducting what he called active imagination, written conversations with the figures that arose from his unconscious, treating them not as symptoms to be interpreted, but as interlocutors to be engaged. You do not need to replicate his specific practice. You need to develop some equivalent form of ongoing, honest, non-judgmental attention to what is happening in your interior that is not being captured by the managed surface. This is the first practice, not a technique, an orientation, a sustained willingness to attend to what is there without immediately converting it into something more manageable. The second practice is the gradual reduction of the automatic management in specific, chosen contexts, not the complete abandonment of the persona. That is not individuation, that is regression. The deliberate, selective reduction of the management in one relationship, one context, one conversation that is chosen, because it has enough safety and enough mutual investment to sustain the exposure of something real. The gradual disclosure of the actual interior to the people who have earned access to it, not performed vulnerability, genuine, specific, careful extension of access to what has been most carefully managed. And the third practice is the sustained engagement with whatever keeps surfacing as the point of greatest resistance, the thing you keep approaching and retreating from, the direction you keep orienting toward, and then finding reasons to redirect away from. The quality in yourself that keeps surfacing in dreams and in disproportionate reactions and in the specific envy that arrives when you encounter it expressed freely in someone else. That point of greatest resistance is almost always the location of the most important material. It is the thing the shadow has been carrying. It is the thing the persona has been most carefully covering. And it is almost always the thing that, when it finally arrives in conscious relationship with the rest of the self, changes the quality of the entire interior in ways that nothing that came before it could. The individuation process does not complete. This is the most important thing to understand about the map and the thing that most people find most difficult to accept. There is no arrival point at which the work is done. There is no state of full individuation that, once achieved, requires no further engagement. Jung himself continued the work until the end of his life. His final published work was left unfinished at his death, not because he had not made progress by every measure available. He had undergone one of the most thoroughgoing individuation processes ever documented, but because the process, when genuinely engaged, does not conclude. It deepens. Each layer of integration reveals the next layer waiting. Each stage of development that is worked through produces a clearer view of the stage that follows. The person at 60 who has been doing this work for 30 years is not closer to finished than the person at 30 who is beginning. They are simply deeper in, and deeper in this specific territory does not mean more complex or more difficult in the exhausting sense. It means more real, more fully inhabited, more genuinely present in the specific moments that constitute the texture of a life. The question is not whether you will eventually reach the end of the process. You will not. The question is whether you will begin, and the answer to that question determines more about the quality of the life ahead of you than any external circumstance or any decision made at the surface level of the performed existence. Begin not perfectly, not with complete understanding of the map, with the specific, ordinary, slightly uncomfortable act of paying honest attention to what is actually there in the interior. That attention sustained over time, with genuine curiosity rather than judgment, with the willingness to follow what it reveals rather than managing what it reveals back into the dark. That attention is the individuation process, not as an achievement, as a practice, the most important one available to a human life.